Hello. My name is Margaret Louise Thompson. I am 74 years old, and if you have a little patience, I'd like to tell you the story of how I learned to stand on my own 2 feet. It wasn't an easy path, but maybe, if you're going through a dark season, this might help light your way. It was the autumn of 1982. The kind of autumn where the leaves fall slowly, as if they're too tired to rush to the ground. I was 27 years old, living in Cookeville, a small town in the heart of Tennessee, and I truly believed my life was already written. My husband, David, worked at a bank. He wore stiff shirts every day and spoke in that soft tone that made people believe he was calm and kind. I believed it too. We had been married for 7 years and had 2 small children, Benjamin, who was 5, and Abigail, who was 3. My daily routine revolved around them. I woke up before the sun, made breakfast, packed lunches, washed clothes, cooked, cleaned the floors, and folded tomorrow's laundry before going to bed, all in order, all as it was supposed to be. To our neighbors, I was the perfect wife, a woman who knew her place in the world. But inside, something hurt. I couldn't quite name it. I didn't know how to describe that feeling of being alive and yet invisible, like a light bulb turned on inside a cardboard box. Then, on a cold November night, the kind where the wind cuts like a blade and your soul already feels tired from the day, I found out a truth that would change everything. David was cheating on me. I didn't go looking for it. The truth came to me like a storm. First, there was a note forgotten in his pants pocket, a pink slip of paper with a rushed message. "See you at 6, as always, L." Then, the scent of a perfume I never wore. And finally, the silence. That heavy, freezing silence between 2 people who share a roof, but nothing else. I confronted him. Of course I did. I may have been quiet, but I wasn't stupid. David denied it. Then he raised his voice. Then he tried to make me doubt myself. Told me I was being paranoid, that I was making things up. But deep down, I already knew. That night, after he left to work late, I locked myself in the bathroom with a blanket and cried like a child. Not just because of the betrayal. I cried for the life I had let slip through my fingers. For the dreams I couldn't even remember anymore. For the Margaret I had buried in the name of a family that now felt as fragile as glass. But there, sitting on that cold bathroom floor, my eyes swollen and my soul torn, something inside of me began to shift. A voice, small and quiet, rose up inside me. What if you could be more than this? The next morning, I left the house early and walked to Mrs. Eleanor's house, a retired teacher who lived on the corner of my street. She always had kind eyes and a firm way of speaking. When she saw me, with red eyes and trembling hands, she didn't ask anything. She just said, "Come in. I'll make some tea." She was the one who lent me my first book, an old volume of American literature. She told me that if I wanted to learn, she would help me, that it was never too late to start over, and for the first time in many years, someone looked at me as if I were capable of something important. That night, while my children slept and David snored on the couch, I read the first 10 pages of that book with my heart racing. I felt like I was stepping into forbidden territory, rediscovering a part of myself that had been asleep for far too long. I found an old notebook, wrote my name on the cover, and on impulse I wrote underneath it, "Day 1 of the new Margaret." In the days that followed, I started studying in secret. When I went to the market, I set aside a few coins from the change and hid them in an empty cookie tin. Over time, I bought pencils, paper, and a used dictionary from a thrift store in the next town over. Of course, David found out, and he laughed, loudly, as if it were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. What are you going to do? Graduate and teach in the living room? I just smiled, not on the outside. Not yet, but inside, because for the first time, what he thought didn't matter so much anymore. The road ahead was long, but on that November night, a part of me died, and another part, braver, more alive, was born. I didn't know where the path would lead. I only knew I had to follow it. For me, for my children, for the Margaret I still had a chance to become. Well now, sweetheart, if you've been enjoying this little story of mine, don't forget to tap that like button and subscribe to the channel, all right? It helps more than you know. I may be an old lady now, but I've still got plenty more. Stories tucked away. Stories that might just warm your heart or make you see life a little differently. Thank you for sitting a spell with me. It truly means the world. Bless your heart. I still remember the day I walked into the Adult Education Center in the neighboring town of Livingston. It was a Wednesday morning, still a little chilly from the tail end of winter, and I had waited for both of my children to be safely dropped off at school before taking the bus alone. I had never ridden that bus before. My hands trembled the entire way, not from fear of the ride, but from the quiet terror of doing something just for me. I wore my best sweater, the blue one my mother had given me before she passed, and carried a small folder with the only notebook I owned. I must have looked completely out of place. Just another tired housewife clinging to something that didn't make sense to anyone but herself. The receptionist at the center, a kind woman named Sheila, welcomed me with a smile that reached her eyes. She didn't ask me why I was there. She simply said, "You're right on time. Come with me." There were 7 of us in that classroom. I remember all their faces. James, a man in his 50s who had worked construction his whole life. Lisa, a young mother who had dropped out of school at 16. And me, the woman who had forgotten what it felt like to want something that didn't involve laundry or dinner plans. The teacher, Mr. Harrison, was tall and quiet, with wireframe glasses and the kind of patience you rarely find in the world anymore. He didn't make us feel small. He didn't talk down to us. Instead, he said something that would stay with me forever. You are not here because you failed. You are here because you are brave enough to begin. That night, when I came home, I didn't say a word to David. I made dinner, bathed the kids, helped Benjamin with his spelling words, and then I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, trying to remember how to divide fractions. My brain was stiff, slow, but my heart was finally awake. The weeks passed and I began to change, not loudly, not in a way that others could immediately notice, but inside, something was rebuilding itself. My voice became clearer. My shoulders stood taller. I started walking differently, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for existing. David, of course, noticed, and he didn't like it. At first, it was just small comments. "You've been spending a lot of time out lately." Then, "You're not as warm as you used to be." And then finally, one night, when I came home a little late after a class, he was waiting in the living room, arms crossed. He asked me flat out, "Why are you doing this?" And I answered with the truth, spoken aloud for the first time in my life, "Because I want more." He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply stood up, looked at me, and walked out of the room. For the next few days, he barely spoke to me. I'd like to say I was hurt, but truthfully, I felt lighter. around that time my children started noticing something too. Abigail asked why I smiled more. Benjamin asked what the books were about. One night I caught them pretending to be students at the kitchen table, mimicking me by scribbling in old notebooks. That image of my children seeing me not just as a mother, but as a person chasing something, gave me a kind of joy I didn't know I was allowed to feel. 3 months later, I passed my GED practice exam. I cried in the bathroom stall when I saw the score. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. But because it was mine. Earned. Real. A piece of proof that I was not the story people told about me. I was writing my own. One line at a time. David and I were drifting, like two boats anchored in different oceans. There was no screaming, no dramatic final moment. Just the quiet, inevitable truth that we were no longer meant to be each other's future. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, I sat him down and said, "I think we're done pretending." He nodded, and just like that, it was over. I found a small apartment with the help of Mrs. Eleanor and a few kind neighbors. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, thin walls, an oven that made strange noises. But it was ours, mine and the kids. And every night I sat on that second-hand couch with a lamp beside me and studied like my life depended on it. Because in a way it did. I wasn't just learning math and grammar. I was learning who I was. I was finding pieces of myself buried under years of silence, and slowly, carefully, I was putting them back together. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would be living on my own, raising 2 children, studying to become a teacher, I would have laughed, or cried, or both. But here I was. Tired, yes, but awake, alive, becoming. There is something indescribably strange about becoming a beginner in your 30s. At an age when most people are settling into careers, building their futures with confidence, I was just beginning to learn how to spell possibility. The fall of 1983 marked a turning point. I officially earned my GED. The certificate arrived in a plain envelope, almost too modest for what it meant to me. I held it like it was made of glass. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time, from pride. Not the kind of pride that shouts, the kind that blooms quietly, like sunlight warming the frost from a window pane. I showed it to Benjamin and Abigail that same night. Benjamin clapped his hands and said, "Mommy, you did it." Abigail kissed my cheek and whispered, "I knew you were smart. I don't think they'll ever understand what that moment meant to me. How their belief, pure and unconditional, stitched something back together inside me that I thought had been torn forever." With my GED in hand, I began applying for local certificate programs. I couldn't afford a university just yet, and I didn't have the luxury of time. I needed to find a way to provide for my family. And more than that, I needed to do something that mattered to me. I kept going back to one image, a chalkboard, a quiet classroom, and me standing in front of it. Not as a student, but as a teacher. I don't know why that image had taken hold of me so fiercely. Maybe because for so long, I had been invisible. And now, I wanted to help others see themselves. I enrolled in a 2-year community college program in education. It was only a 30-minute bus ride away, but to me, it felt like crossing a continent. I was one of the oldest students in the room. Most of the others were barely out of high school, full of energy, with their futures unwritten. I felt out of place at first, a single mother, carrying textbooks in a worn-out tote bag and folding laundry between chapters of child psychology. But slowly I found my rhythm. I sat in the front row. I asked questions. I stayed late to talk to professors. I wasn't the smartest person in the room, but I was the most determined, and sometimes that's enough. I still worked part-time at a diner 3 nights a week to pay rent and buy groceries. The shifts were long, the tips inconsistent. But there was dignity in it. I had never known what it felt like to earn something, completely on my own. I used to think strength was silence, that enduring things quietly made me virtuous. But now I understood. Real strength is the choice to keep going, even when it would be easier to give up. The program was hard. There were nights I nearly gave up, when the math assignments overwhelmed me, or the bus was late and the kids were hungry. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the version of myself who sat crying on the bathroom floor the night she discovered her husband's betrayal. That woman didn't give up. She rose, and I owed it to her to keep rising. One of the professors, Dr. Emily Carter, took special interest in me. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone sit up straighter. One afternoon after class, she asked to speak with me privately. I thought I had done something wrong. Instead, she said something I will never forget. "Margaret," she said, "you have something that can't be taught. You listen. You see people. That's what makes a great teacher." I think I nodded, but inside I was trying to keep from crying. For so long I had felt unseen. To hear someone tell me that I saw others, that I mattered, was more than just kind. It was healing. By the end of that year, I had completed my first internship at a local elementary school. I was assigned to Ms. Jacobs's 2nd grade class. The first time I stood in front of those children, holding a picture book with shaking hands, I realized something. I belonged there, not just in the classroom, in my own life. These children didn't know my story. They didn't know Ain Rai had once believed I was worth nothing more than dishes and duty. They just saw a woman who smiled at them, who knelt to tie their shoes, who clapped when they spelled giraffe correctly. And maybe that was the most beautiful part. They didn't care about who I used to be. They loved who I was becoming. I still had a long way to go. Rent was tight. I often skipped meals so my children wouldn't have to. There were days I cried quietly into my pillow, exhausted beyond words. But I was no longer trapped. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something. Not just a career, not just a new identity, but a life that belonged to me. A real life. Sometimes people think that when you decide to change your life, the world will open up for you like a sunrise, that doors will unlock, people will cheer, and everything will fall into place. But what I learned is this: when a woman dares to become something more, the world often resists her, not with force, with silence, with cold shoulders, with whispers behind her back. When word spread through our town that I had left David, people didn't ask how I was doing. They asked why I was doing it, as if I had abandoned a comfortable life for no reason, as if betrayal wasn't enough, as if dreaming was suspicious. At the grocery store, I noticed the glances, the way conversations paused when I entered an aisle. Some of the other mothers at the school stopped inviting Abigail to birthday parties. They didn't say it outright, of course, but their polite smiles were lined with judgment. I wasn't one of them anymore. I had broken the unspoken rule. I had chosen myself. But here's the secret they didn't know. I wasn't lonely. Not really. For the first time in my adult life, I had myself. And I was finally starting to like the woman I saw in the mirror. Still, there were days when the weight felt too heavy. There was a night, a Wednesday, when I came home late after a long shift at the diner. The babysitter had fallen asleep on the couch, and my children were curled up together, using one another as pillows. The fridge had only half a carton of milk and a few bruised apples. I sat on the floor, leaned my head back against the kitchen cabinet, and wept. Not because I wanted to quit, but because I was tired of being brave all the time. The next morning, Benjamin handed me a drawing. It was a stick figure version of me, standing in front of a classroom, holding a book, surrounded by little smiling faces. Above it, in his crooked handwriting, he had written, "My mom is a teacher. She is the best one." I hugged him so tight he squealed. That drawing lived on my fridge for the next 20 years. Some days that was all I had. Faith from a child, a smile from a stranger, or the quiet warmth of knowing I hadn't given up. I finished the community college program with honors. At the ceremony, I didn't have family. In the crowd, no parents, no husband. But my children were there, dressed in their best clothes, clapping and shouting when they called my name. I walked across that stage, not just for me, but for every woman who had ever been told she was just something. Just a mother, just a wife, just a helper. I was no longer just anything. A few months later, I got my first job offer, a long-term substitute teaching position at a public school 2 towns over. It wasn't permanent, and the pay was modest. But to me, it was a golden door swinging, wide open. I took it. I commuted by bus every morning. Left the apartment before sunrise. Came home after dark. I'd pick up groceries with tired feet, grade papers at the kitchen table, and fall asleep with a red pen still in my hand. But I was doing the thing I had once thought impossible. I was teaching. I was earning. I was leading little minds through books and numbers and kindness. One afternoon, as I was helping a student named Clara with her reading, she looked up and asked, "Were you always a teacher?" I paused. "No," I said. "I became one." She nodded thoughtfully and went back to her book, not realizing she'd just helped me define everything I had been through. I wasn't born strong. I wasn't born brave. I became. Becoming isn't a one-time act. It's a choice you make every single morning, even when your knees ache and your heart is worn, even when people don't understand you, even when you're scared, especially when you're scared. In the small apartment we called home, I started keeping a journal. Every night, even if only for 5 minutes, I wrote down one thing I was proud of. Some days, it was big, like finishing a chapter in a textbook. Other days it was small, like not crying when I felt overwhelmed. Looking back now, I see how those tiny victories saved me. I had no roadmap. No one in my family had done what I was doing. But I kept going. I kept becoming. And slowly, quietly, I began to imagine a future where I wouldn't have to fight this hard forever. A future where I could stand in a classroom, full-time, with my own students and my own voice, and say to them, "You can change your life too." Because if I could come from the floor of a cold bathroom in Tennessee, broken and unsure, to the front of a classroom filled with possibility, then maybe anything was possible. And I wasn't done yet. By the summer of 1985, I had been teaching for nearly a full academic year as a long-term substitute. The pay was meager, the hours demanding, and the commute long. But I woke up every day with purpose in my chest. I no longer felt like someone going through the motions of life. I felt alive. That classroom, though small and worn, became my sanctuary. The walls were beige, the windows creaked in the wind, and half the desks had uneven legs. But to me, it was a palace. Each desk held a story, a child full of potential, a young person waiting to be seen, and I made it my mission to see them. I learned their names quickly. I learned which of them struggled to read but pretended otherwise, and which ones wrote stories in the margins of their math notebooks. I brought in crayons from my own home, hung paper stars from the ceiling, and taped up their drawings as if they were masterpieces. Because to me they were. There was one boy I'll never forget. His name was Daniel. Daniel was 8 years old and already looked tired of the world. He never raised his hand, barely spoke. He sat in the back with his hoodie pulled tight, like he wanted to disappear. Most days I could tell he hadn't had a breakfast. I started packing an extra granola bar in my bag each morning and slipping it to him with his morning worksheet. I never said a word about it, and neither did he. But slowly, he started showing up earlier, staying after class. One afternoon, as we sat together reviewing a reading passage, he looked up and said, "You don't give up on people, do you?" "No," I said, "because someone didn't give up on me." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just teaching subjects. I was passing forward a kind of hope that had once saved my life. Meanwhile, life outside the classroom remained difficult. Money was always tight. Every dollar was accounted for. I learned to stretch meals with rice, make clothes last longer, and entertain my children with library books and walks through the park. I told them we didn't have less, we just had different. And somehow they believed me. The apartment was still small, but it felt warmer now. I hung their artwork on the hallway wall. We created a tradition of Friday night pancakes and reading aloud on Sunday mornings. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was ours. And that made all the difference. I applied for full-time teaching jobs at every school within a 2-hour radius. Rejection letters came in slowly, each one stinging like a fresh bruise. Lack of experience. Position filled. We appreciate your interest. Still, I kept teaching, kept learning, kept believing. Mrs. Eleanor continued to visit on weekends. She brought books and encouragement, sometimes sitting quietly in my kitchen as I graded papers. One day she said something that struck me to my core. "You were always a teacher, Margaret. You just needed a place to grow your wings." I didn't know it then, but my wings were already forming. In late spring, I received a phone call I will never forget. The principal at Maple Grove Elementary, a public school in a nearby town, had heard about me through one of my college professors. They had an opening, a third-grade position, full-time, with benefits. I thought it was a mistake. I asked the woman on the phone to repeat herself twice. When I hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, the phone still in my hand, heart pounding. Then, without thinking, I burst into tears. Not soft ones, the kind of tears that come from deep inside, when something long hoped for finally arrives. I got the job. My first day at Maple Grove was on a Monday in August. I wore a second-hand blazer that I had ironed the night before, and a pair of shoes I had polished until the leather shone. Abigail helped me pack my lunch. Benjamin handed me a note that read, "You got this, Mom." I walked into my new classroom with trembling hands but a steady heart. This room was bigger, brighter. The walls had fresh paint. There were cubbies and a bookshelf and a chalkboard that stretched across the front. I ran my hand across the teacher's desk, my desk, and took a deep breath. And just like that, I had become what I once only dared to imagine. But this wasn't the end of my journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer just rebuild myself but help others do the same, because that's what true healing looks like. Not just surviving, but reaching back to lift someone else up behind you. That's what I had become. Not just a teacher, a woman who dared to rise and chose to carry others with her. The first year at Maple Grove Elementary taught me more than any textbook ever had. Being in my own classroom was like living inside a dream. I had once been too afraid to speak out loud. The desks had name tags. My name was on the door. My own bulletin board, my own chalk supply, my own space in the teacher's lounge. It all felt surreal. Every morning as I turned the key to open my room, I whispered a quiet thank you to God, to time, to the broken road that brought me there. I was no longer trying to prove I belonged. I belonged. Still, it wasn't easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Some students came to school hungry, some tired from nights without sleep, some angry from things they couldn't explain. Their behavior wasn't always sweet. Some days the room felt like a storm. But I had lived through storms far worse. I recognized that look in their eyes. I had worn it myself once. That look of someone silently screaming to be seen. So, I taught with more than my head. I taught with my heart. When children misbehaved, I didn't just send them to the hallway. I knelt beside them and asked, "What's hurting you today?" When a child failed a test, I didn't scold. I reminded them, "This test doesn't define you. I see how hard you're trying." And when they succeeded even in the smallest ways, tying their shoes alone, finishing a book, raising their hand for the first time, I celebrated like it was a parade. I didn't have fancy resources, but I had empathy. I had grit. I had lived enough pain to know how powerful love could be when it shows up quietly, day after day. The children began to change. So did I. They trusted me, told me secrets they hadn't told anyone, wrote notes that said things like, "You make school feel safe," or, "You're the best part of my day." One boy, Elijah, was repeating the grade. He had been labeled trouble by past teachers, but I refused to believe a child could be reduced to a label. I let him sit near me, gave him small tasks to build confidence, let him take home books that I knew he'd enjoy. By mid-year, he was reading out loud in class. By the end of the year, he was writing stories. On the last day of school, he ran up and hugged me tight and said, "You're the reason I don't hate reading anymore." I drove home that day in silence, tears blurring my view of the road, my heart filled to the brim. I wasn't just teaching content. I was undoing damage. I was offering children the thing I never had at their age, a place where they mattered. At home, things were improving too. Benjamin was growing fast, curious, thoughtful, already talking about being a scientist. Abigail had a spark of creativity I couldn't keep up with. She drew pictures on every scrap of paper she could find and dreamed of writing books one day. They were thriving, not because life was perfect, but because they had seen me fight. They had seen that broken doesn't mean finished, and that love, when paired with courage, can be enough to build a new life, and something beautiful began to happen between us. We started to laugh more, real, deep, joyful laughter, the kind that fills a room. I had once feared that leaving David would ruin their childhood, but what I saw now was that choosing peace had saved it. One evening, after dinner, Abigail looked at me and asked, "Mom, are you happy?" I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because it meant so much that she had asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm tired and life is still hard sometimes. But yes, I am happy." She smiled and went back to her coloring. But I sat there a little longer, letting the weight of that word settle in. Happy. Not a word I used much in my old life. Not a word I thought belonged to women like me. Women who had been through fire, who had been dismissed, who had once believed they were only valuable if someone else said so. But now I knew better. Happiness wasn't something handed to you. It was something you built, moment by moment, truth by truth. And sometimes it looked nothing like you imagined. It looked like a 2-bedroom apartment, a handwritten lesson plan, and pancakes for dinner. And that was enough. I began speaking at church events and small gatherings of women in town. Not because I thought I was special, but because people started asking how I did it, how I started over, how I kept going. I always told them the truth. I stopped asking for permission to be myself. Some women wept, others stayed behind to tell me their own stories, quiet, painful, brave. I saw my past in their eyes. I saw my younger self in every woman who whispered, "I don't know if I can do it." And every time I answered the same way, "You don't have to know yet. You just have to start," because that's all I had done. One step, then another. One page, then another. One small choice to believe that I was worth saving, and I was. By the time I reached my 3rd full year at Maple Grove Elementary, something had shifted deep within me. I was no longer holding my breath, waiting for life to fall apart again. I wasn't constantly glancing over my shoulder, afraid that my past might catch up and remind me of who I used to be. No. I was finally standing in the present, fully, gratefully, with both feet planted and my chin lifted. I had not only survived, I had become whole. Each morning, I opened my classroom door with the same quiet reverence I had on my very first day. But there was something different now. Not less awe, but more confidence. My voice carried differently. My decisions were firmer. I didn't question whether I belonged in that space anymore. I knew I did. My students had come to expect more than just lessons from me. They came to me with stories, fears, victories. I wasn't just Mrs. Thompson, the teacher. I was the calm voice during their storms. I was the one who noticed when they were too quiet. I was the one who cheered the loudest when they conquered what they once thought they couldn't. One of my students that year was a girl named Natalie. She was clever but withdrawn, with eyes that held far more than a 10-year-old should carry. I learned gradually that her mother had left and her father worked nights. She often came to school with the same shirt, buttoned wrong, her hair uncombed. The first time I braided her hair before picture day, her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "No one's done that for me since I was little." I told her, "Sometimes the people who love us don't always stay, but that doesn't mean we're alone." That day I realized something else. I wasn't just healing my students. They were healing me too. The more I gave, the more I received. Not in money, not in recognition, but in meaning. I had lived decades without that. But now I woke up every day with it pulsing through my veins. Benjamin was now 12, almost taller than me, with a gentle heart and a mind full of questions. He loved science, but more than that, he loved people. One day he came home from school and said, "I helped a kid today who was getting picked on. I think he just needed someone to talk to." I smiled and said, "You're the kind of person who changes the world, Benjamin." And I meant it. Abigail, now 10, had started writing short stories. She'd leave them on my pillow, sometimes unfinished, asking for feedback. I'd read every word carefully, writing little notes in the margins like, "Beautiful detail," or "Tell me more about how she feels here." We became a house of storytellers, each of us crafting our own voice in different ways. Our living room was often cluttered with notebooks, crayons, library books, and laughter, We had so little in material things, hand-me-down furniture, chipped dishes, but our home felt full. And then, one afternoon, something happened that I didn't expect. I was nominated for a statewide teaching award. When the letter arrived, I read it 3 times before I could process the words. It wasn't just the nomination. It was who had written the recommendation. Dr. Emily Carter, my old professor. She had followed my journey quietly, and in her letter she wrote, "Margaret is the kind of teacher every child deserves. Not because she's perfect, but because she's real." I didn't win the award, but it didn't matter. Being seen, like that, really seen, was enough. It was a validation not of my performance, but of my presence. A few weeks later, during parent-teacher conferences, Natalie's father came in. He was tired, nervous, wearing a flannel shirt and calloused, hands that told 1,000 stories. He sat down and said, "I don't know much about schools, but my daughter talks about you every single day. She said you make her feel like she matters. So, thank you." I swallowed hard, nodded, and said, "She does matter. A lot." That night I cried again, not out of pain, but out of the simple, overwhelming truth that I was living the life I once thought I'd never have. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot that this version of me, the teacher, the mother, the woman who stood steady and sure, had once lived inside, a shell of fear, silence, and self-doubt. The difference now wasn't luck. It was choice. Over and over I had chosen to keep going, even when it would have been easier to give up. And I wanted other women to know they could do the same. So I began speaking more. At women's shelters, community colleges, local support groups. I shared my story not as a tale of tragedy, but as a blueprint for rebirth. I always told them the truth. You don't have to know the whole road. Just take the next step. And that's what I was still doing. Even now, with my roots planted, deep I knew there were still wings left to grow. By the time I turned 35, I had come further than I ever imagined possible. I had built a life from the ruins of another. I had found strength I didn't know I had, and I had learned the quiet power of showing up, day after day, even when no one was watching. But I was beginning to feel something new rising inside me. Not fear, not doubt, calling. I loved my classroom with all my heart. I loved the early mornings, the smell of sharpened pencils, the way children's eyes lit up when they understood something for the first time. But there was a voice inside me now, one that whispered, "You're not done yet." I had spent the last several years helping children find their voices. Now it was time for me to fully claim mine. So I started writing. Not novels, not essays. Just memories. Lessons. Late at night, after the dishes were done and the children had gone to sleep, I would sit at our little kitchen table with a cup of tea and write down everything I had learned. About motherhood. About survival. About love that stays and love that leaves. About becoming. It started small. Pages no one else read. But then one day, Abigail came across one of my notebooks. She flipped through the pages quietly, then looked at me and said, "Mom, people need to read this." I laughed. "It's just my story, sweetheart." "Exactly," she replied. "That's why." Those words sat with me for days. People need to read this. I hadn't thought my life was extraordinary. In fact, most of it had been quite ordinary. Laundry, bills, long nights, small joys. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the most powerful stories weren't about grand victories or perfect people. Maybe they were about the quiet, stubborn act of not giving up. So, with Abigail's encouragement, I submitted one of my essays to a local newspaper. It was called The Woman Who Forgot Herself and Found Something Better. I was sure it would be ignored, but 2 weeks later they published it. The response was overwhelming. Letters began arriving at the school. Women, and some men too, wrote in to say they saw themselves in my words, that they had once sat on cold bathroom floors or stared out windows wondering if it was too late to start over, that my story made them believe they still had time. One woman's letter still lives in my desk drawer. She wrote, "I was packing my bags to leave this life. Then I read your story. I haven't unpacked yet, but I'm still here. And maybe that's enough for today." I sat with that letter pressed to my chest for a long time, whispering, "Thank you for staying." After that, I kept writing. I wrote once a month for the paper, and eventually I began speaking at conferences. Not as an expert, but as someone who had walked through fire and found something worth carrying out of it. I never pretended to have all the answers. I just offered one truth. You can rebuild your life, one honest step at a time. Back at home, life moved forward. Benjamin started high school, already thinking about college. Abigail continued writing, stories, poems, scripts. Our home remained modest, but it was rich in ways I never imagined possible. We had laughter, trust, purpose. One night, as I graded papers, Abigail asked, "Do you miss the old days, Mom?" I looked up, surprised by the question. "No," I said. "I miss who I used to imagine I could be. But I don't miss the days I was too afraid to try." She nodded and said, "I'm glad you tried." That night, I realized something important. My children hadn't just watched me build a life. They had built it with me. Every late-night story, every tear we wiped together, every moment I chose growth over resentment, they had been beside me for all of it. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving, and still I knew this wasn't the final chapter. Had walked through betrayal, through poverty, through shame. I had walked through quiet classrooms and noisy cafeterias, through long commutes and short nights. And now, I was walking through a new season, one of abundance. Not material abundance, something deeper. The abundance of knowing who I was. I had gone from invisible to invincible. Not because I conquered the world, but because I stopped hiding from myself. And with every word I wrote, every child I taught, every woman I encouraged, I was planting something that would outlast me, roots and wings. By the time Benjamin graduated from high school, I felt like I had climbed a mountain I never knew I was strong enough to face. Watching him walk across that stage in his cap and gown, I clapped until my hands stung. When his name was called, Benjamin Thomas Thompson, I stood up, tears clouding my vision, and let myself feel everything. He had done it. We had done it. After the ceremony, he found me in the crowd, hugged me tight, and said, "I got in, Mom. University of Tennessee. They gave me a scholarship." I think my heart stopped for a moment. A scholarship. The child I raised on boxed macaroni and bedtime stories was going to college. He was going to study biology, his dream. I couldn't speak. I just hugged him harder. When we got home that night, I pulled out the old cookie tin where I used to hide change. The same one that once held my dream of buying pencils and notebooks when I had nothing else. I opened it and placed inside a letter I had written. To Benjamin years earlier, back when he was only 10, and I was still fighting for my own GED. It said, if you ever forget what you're made of, remember this. You were raised by someone who refused to quit, and that same fire is in you." He read it silently, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet. That moment didn't just belong to him. It belonged to every night I stayed up late studying while he slept nearby. It belonged to every whispered prayer I made while riding the bus to work. It belonged to the girl I used to be, the one who cried alone in a locked bathroom, wondering if she was strong enough to leave a man who didn't love her well. She didn't just survive. She helped her son rise higher than she ever thought she could. And Abigail, my sweet, fierce Abigail. She wasn't far behind. By 13, she had already won 2 writing contests. Her stories weren't just creative. They were honest. She wrote about girls who were both soft and brave, about mothers who carried silent battles, about small towns and big dreams. When I read her words, I saw pieces of my own story reflected back, only this time through the eyes of a child who had witnessed the rebuilding. One evening, as we sat on the porch under a summer sky, she said, "Do you ever wonder who you would have been if you hadn't married Dad?" I thought about it. I really did. But then I looked at her, at Benjamin, at the life we had carved out with our bare hands, and I said no, because every part of my story, even the hardest parts, brought me here, to you, and to who I am now. Pain, I had learned, doesn't disqualify you from joy. In fact, it deepens your capacity to feel it. The next few years passed in a blur of milestones. I published a collection of essays, self-funded and modest, called The Quiet Rise, Stories from the Floor to the Front of the Room. To my surprise, it gained traction, not bestseller lists or big publishing houses, but something more meaningful. Letters from readers, a librarian in Iowa, a stay-at-home mom in Georgia, a teacher in Oregon, each one saying the same thing. I thought I was alone, but you helped me remember who I used to be. I was invited to speak at more events, and each time I stood in front of those crowds, women, educators, survivors, dreamers, and reminded them of one simple truth. You don't have to be fearless to move forward. You just have to be willing. My voice, once hidden behind the needs of everyone else, had become something powerful. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. At school, I began mentoring new teachers. I could spot the ones who were close to burning out. I'd find them in the lounge, eyes heavy, voices strained, and I'd sit beside them and ask, "How's your heart?" They'd usually laugh at first, then they'd start talking, and I would listen, really listen, because I knew how it felt to wonder if you were enough. In those quiet moments, I gave them what Mrs. Eleanor had once given me, belief, and I never forgot Eleanor. She passed away the year Abigail turned 16. I visited her every week during her last months. One afternoon, she took my hand and whispered, "You turned the page, Margaret. You wrote a better ending." She was right, but even more beautiful. Oh, I wasn't done writing. My legacy wasn't going to be wealth or fame. It would be lives changed, in classrooms, in small towns, in kitchen tables where women held their breath and hoped for something more. I had once believed I was broken, but now I understood. I had simply been in progress, and progress, no matter how quiet, is still a kind of miracle. There's a kind of beauty that only comes with age. It's not the beauty they sell in magazines or advertise on billboards. It's not in smooth skin or perfect posture. It's in knowing who you are, without apology, without doubt. It's in waking up and feeling centered, even when the world around you spins. By the time I turned 45, I had reached a peace I never thought I would find. My children were thriving. Benjamin was in his 3rd year of college, already talking about internships and graduate school. He called every Sunday, sometimes just to hear my voice. Abigail, 17 by then, had been accepted into a summer writing program at a university in North Carolina. I drove her there myself. The whole way, she read to me from one of her stories, about a girl who ran barefoot through a field and found a version of herself hiding in the wildflowers. When she finished, I asked, "Did you write that about you?" She smiled and said, "About us." I wanted to pull the car over just to hug her. Watching my children step into their own paths, their own voices, was one of the greatest joys of my life. Not because they were successful, though they were, but because they were whole. They were kind, grounded, open-hearted, and I knew that somewhere along the way, between the ramen noodles and late-night homework sessions, I had helped give them that. But it wasn't just motherhood that filled me. Teaching still lit a fire in me. By that time, I was one of the most senior teachers at Maple Grove Elementary. New teachers came and went, but I remained. Not because I didn't have other options, but because I still loved it. The sound of children learning, the joy in their faces when they discovered they could do something hard, the quiet trust they placed in me day after day. There was a girl in my 4th grade class that year named Lydia. She reminded me so much of myself at that age. Shy, eager to please, always scribbling in the margins of her notebook. One day I found a poem she had written and forgotten to take home. It said, "I'm not loud, but I'm strong. I've been quiet for too long. My voice is soft, but it's real. And one day, the world will feel." I copied it down and carried it, in my wallet for months. That's what I saw in my students. Quiet strength waiting to be invited out into the light. And somewhere along the way, my classroom became more than a place of instruction. It became a haven, a place where children who were hurting could breathe, where the ones who didn't fit in anywhere else fit with me. I started something called Monday Minutes. Every Monday morning before we began our lessons, I gave the students a full 60 seconds to write whatever was on their minds. No grammar rules, no grades, no structure. Just their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, and what they wrote broke me open. I miss my grandma. I don't think I'm smart. My dad left again. I want to be an artist, but I'm scared. I read every single word. I responded to each one with a short note of encouragement. You are loved. You are not alone. You can be scared and brave at the same time. And little by little, I watched them bloom. That same year, I was honored with a district teaching award. They held a small ceremony at a local banquet hall. I wore the same blue dress I had worn to Benjamin's graduation. Abigail came with me. When they called my name, I walked to the stage to the sound of applause. And for a brief moment, I let myself feel the weight of what I had built. Not just a career, a legacy. When I gave my short acceptance speech, I didn't talk about test scores or lesson plans. I talked about Lydia, about Elijah, about Natalie, about every child whose story had passed through my hands like a sacred thread. I said, I used to think I was invisible. Now I know. I was simply waiting to be seen. And now, I help others see themselves. That is my life's greatest joy. The room went quiet, and then the applause came again, soft but lasting. Afterward, a young teacher approached me. She looked nervous, hopeful. She said, I don't know how to be the kind of teacher you are. I smiled and replied, neither did I. I just started by loving the children more than I feared failing. She cried, and I held her hand, the way Eleanor once held mine. Full circle moments are rare, but they come, and when they do, they show you how far you've traveled. I had walked from heartbreak to healing, from silence to voice, from shame to purpose, and I was not finished yet. In the quieter seasons of life, when the dust settles and the children are grown, you start to notice things you never had time to before. The sound of the wind through the trees outside your window, the way a morning cup of coffee feels like, a small kind of miracle. The silence after a long day, no longer lonely, just full. By the time I was in my early 50s, both of my children had left home. Benjamin had finished his master's degree in biology and was working in a research lab in Virginia. He had found a partner, a kind and steady young woman named Emily, and they eventually married under a grove of oak trees one soft autumn afternoon. I wore a pale gray dress and cried through half the ceremony, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that my little boy, who once asked me if superheroes were real, had become a man of strength and quiet integrity. Abigail went on to study literature. She called me nearly every week from her dorm, her voice always dancing with ideas. She wrote essays that made me pause mid-sentence and reread them, stunned by how much heart and insight lived inside her words. One day she told me, "I want to write a book one day about you." I laughed and said, "Just don't tell them about the time I burned the spaghetti 3 nights in a row." But I knew she would write something far more meaningful than kitchen mishaps. She would write about becoming. And I realized, maybe that would be my true legacy. Not just the classroom lessons or the newspaper columns or the speeches I gave in small church halls, but the quiet daily work of rebuilding a life that once felt shattered. The kind of story that passed down in tone, in example, in the way my daughter walked into the world with her shoulders back and her eyes open. I kept teaching until I was 64. People asked me why I didn't retire earlier, especially when I reached the age that many do. But I told them the truth, because I still love it. Because even after decades of standing in front of chalkboards and circle rugs, I still felt something sacred every time I watched a child find the courage to raise their hand. I still found joy in taping their art to the walls, in reading their messy poems, in watching their faces light up when they finally understood how to divide fractions or spell elephant correctly. It was never just about the curriculum. It was always about the connection. But eventually I knew it was time. Time to slow down, to hand the baton to the next generation of teachers, many of whom I had mentored. On my last day, the school hosted a small assembly. Former students came back, some now adults, with children of their own. One after another they came, up to hug me, to say thank you, to share the impact a single moment or word had on their lives. One woman said, "You were the first person who ever told me I was smart." A man said, "You saw something in me when no one else did." Another, tearful, said, "You made me feel like I mattered." I stood there, hands clasped, heart wide open, overwhelmed by what a single life, my life, had become. Not a grand story in headlines, but a thread in so many others. When I finally walked out of Maple Grove Elementary for the last time, I paused on the front steps. The building behind me, the sky soft and pink ahead. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you," not just to the school, but to her, the woman I used to be, the one who had once believed her life was over when her husband walked away, the one who read books in secret, who hid notebooks under couch cushions, who cried into a pillow while her children slept in the next room. She had gotten me here, and now it was time for something new. I moved into a small cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by wildflowers and tall pines. I planted a garden. I wrote in the mornings and walked in the evenings. I still spoke occasionally at events, but more often I just listened. I mentored young teachers and welcomed women into my living room who needed someone to say, "You're not too late," because that's what I had once needed to hear. You're not too late. It doesn't matter where you start, how much you've lost, or how long it's taken you to believe in your own worth. You can still rise. You can still become. I am 74 years old now. Some mornings when I look in the mirror, I still catch glimpses of the woman I used to be. The girl who married young, the mother who struggled, the teacher who stayed late grading essays by the glow of a kitchen lamp. But what I see more than anything now is a face that has earned its lines, not from stress alone, but from living deeply. The truth is, I never expected to live this long. Not because of health or fear, but because there was a time, long ago, when I couldn't imagine what life looked like beyond surviving, when every day felt like treading water, hoping just to make it to bedtime without falling apart. And now, here I am, not only alive, but full of life. My children visit often. Benjamin now teaches at a university. He tells me about his students, the way I once told stories about mine, with pride and tenderness. He and Emily have 2 children of their own. I am Grandma Maggie. To little Thomas and June, and I spoil them unapologetically with cookies, books, and stories about how their father once spilled milk on my GED diploma. Abigail did write that book. She called it Becoming Margaret, and I cried through the entire first reading. It wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who has ever been overlooked, every voice that had gone quiet, every heart that had decided, I want more. She told the truth. Not all of it was pretty, but it was real, and that is the most I ever hoped for, to leave something real behind. In my cottage, the garden blooms without permission, wildflowers that grow where they please, tomatoes that stretch their vines across the fence, bees that dance without shame. It is not a neat garden, but it is mine. It reminds me of my life. Messy in places, unpredictable, but undeniably beautiful. I still keep the old cookie tin on a shelf in my bedroom. Inside it are scraps of paper, dried petals, small notes from students, old photos, a copy of my GED certificate, and a letter from a woman who once told me, "Your story saved mine." Sometimes I open it when I forget who I am. Because, yes, even now there are days when doubt knocks on the door. But I don't answer it anymore. Not like I used to. I simply nod toward the tin and say, I've already built something better. Not out of spite, not to prove anyone wrong, but because I proved myself right. I was never just a housewife, never just a mother, never just a substitute teacher. I was always a woman in progress, a woman with stories in her skin and lessons in her spine, a woman who chose, over and over, to rise. And now, as I sit here writing these final words, I think about you. Yes, you, the one reading this. Maybe you're wondering if it's too late to change your life. Maybe you're standing in a kitchen somewhere, holding a coffee cup and wondering how you got here, and whether there's still time for something more. Let me tell you what I wish someone had told me. You are not finished. You are not too broken. You are not too far behind. You are not too old, too tired, too used up. You are a story still unfolding. You are a garden waiting to bloom. You are a voice that deserves to be heard. And if no one else has said it yet, let me be the first. You are allowed to become someone new. Because I did. My name is Margaret Louise Thompson. I used to be afraid of my own reflection. Now I look in the mirror and see a woman who built a life worth living. Not with ease, but with courage. Not with luck, but with love. And if I could do it, so can you.